You're listening to Southeast Radio's Business Matters, with thanks to Wexford Insurances. Wexford Insurances. More information at wexfordinsurance.com.
And joining us now to discuss the range of grants provided by Wexford Local Development is their CEO, Brian Kehoe. Good morning, Brian, and thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Karl.
If we start by getting a little bit of history to Wexford Local Development, because I know there is some confusion out there in relation to Word and WLD and Leader, so maybe if you could just provide some clarity in relation to that, please.
Yes, Karl. Wexford Local Development is a community-based organisation. It's a company limited by guarantee that was established towards the end of 2008 as part of a government decision to merge a number of local development organisations. So at that time, Wexford Organisation for Rural Development, Wexford Area Partnership and County Wexford Partnership came together and merged to form a new entity, Wexford Local Development.
So now, for the purpose of this interview, we're going to focus on the Rural Development Programme and specifically in relation to the grant aid that's available to both start-up and expanding businesses across the county.
Well, the Leader programme, if I could just explain briefly, Karl, is a programme that has been around for about 20 years now. It's a European funded programme, so 55% of our funding comes from the European Commission. The programme has a long history in Ireland, and as you mentioned earlier in the interview, it originally was delivered by Word and it's now being delivered by Wexford Local Development. The programme itself, I suppose there are two strands to it. One would be focused on enterprise and the other on community. On the enterprise side, we've three different types of grant available to businesses, and they can be start-up businesses or they can be businesses who are expanding. I suppose the key thing to mention is that they must be micro enterprise or micro businesses. What that means is that the number of employees that they have at the time they apply must be less than 10, or their turnover must be less than 2 million. In terms of the types of grant available, we have a capital grant, which would cover investment in infrastructure, in equipment, in machinery, and that's funded at a 50% basis, on a 50-50 basis, up to a maximum of 150,000 in funding. We've two other grants then, Karl, as well. One is a feasibility study grant, which is there to obviously allow somebody to explore an idea, develop a product, research a market, and we can fund up to 75% of the costs associated with the study at a limit of €30,000. And then finally, we have a training grant, which is funded at 100%. And that can be up to 150,000 also.
So they're the types of grants that are available. And what type of businesses are eligible to apply for those grants?
It's relatively broad, Karl. I suppose it's in some ways, without wanting to sound negative, it's probably easier to explain what's not eligible. And I suppose we're always concerned that if we grant aid one business, that we don't put somebody else out of business, or it's seen to be unfair competition. So there are some sectors, such as, for example, the retail sector, distribution and so on, that would be ineligible, clearly because there's so many businesses out there already. So that's the first thing to mention. There are other areas that we can't fund simply because there may be other funding streams available. But for anybody who has an idea, we'd ask them to contact us initially, not to be put off by that, and we can determine straight away whether or not we think they would be eligible.
Give me some examples of some of the projects that you would have funded over the past 12 months across County Wexford.
Sure. We've been involved in a very wide range of projects. Typically on the enterprise side, our projects would fit into a number of categories such as tourism, renewable energy, crafts and food. One example there recently that would have been featured on The Apprentice was Featherbed Ice Cream, which we funded, a very successful startup business manufacturing ice cream. And there are many others, Karl, which I could give examples of. On the tourism side, we would have funded some, I suppose, iconic attractions such as National Heritage Park. We've also funded a number of smaller operators such as the Hook Safari, which is obviously a much smaller business located just off Hook Head and focused on the adventure side of things.
On average, what size would the typical grant be that WLD would be providing?
Well, typically, Karl, the average grant across the board would be about 20,000 per project. Now, to date, we have approved 5 million in funding, and that's in since about the middle of 2009. We've funded just over 250 projects. Not all of those would be enterprise, but quite a few would be. So that's typically the amount involved.
And are you on target to fulfil your grant aid from a budgetary perspective this year?
Well, the programme itself finishes at the end of next year, the end of 2013. So I suppose there's a window of opportunity there for potential projects and applicants. We're not anywhere near our target yet. We have a target of €9 million. As I've just said, we've allocated 5 million, so we've roughly about 4 million that we can allocate to projects. In actual fact, Karl, there's even more available in that nationally there is an underspend in the programme. So, it's on a first come, first served basis at the moment. And I suppose the message I want to get across here today is that we're very definitely open for business. We want to hear from people with ideas, and we want to hear from people who have genuine commercial projects.
Just to be clear on that, you have €4 million of funding to spend between now and December 2013.
Yes, that's exactly it.
And in terms of the geographic requirement for somebody to be living within the county, are there any restrictions in relation to somebody applying for a grant? Let's say, for instance, if they're from Wexford Town.
Yeah, the only restriction at the moment, Karl, unfortunately, is if a business is based in Wexford Town within the borough council boundaries, we can't fund that business. We're trying to get that changed at the moment. There's a whole lobbying process in place, but it hasn't happened yet. And I suppose until it does happen, we're stuck with that restriction, which is unfortunate. But anybody in any of the other towns would be eligible. So while LEADER is a rural development programme, I think sometimes the title rural may put people off, that live in towns, and they may think, well, we're not in a rural area, so therefore we're not eligible.
And just to go back to some of the grants that you mentioned earlier, tell me exactly what the capital grant covers.
Yeah, the capital grant covers any investment in typically, equipment, machinery. It could be investment in a workshop. It could be in office equipment. It could be indeed in marketing. So it's typically any capital cost in a business. The only thing we don't cover, Karl, would be running costs of a business. So we don't have that facility. So any kind of running or operational costs we can't cover. So most other costs would be covered under the capital grant. Obviously, the promoter has to come up with the other 50%.
Just in relation to the feasibility study grant, what does that cover?
Yeah, the feasibility study grant is there to basically allow somebody to tease out an idea, or it could be somebody that has a product that they need to fine tune, or it could be somebody that has developed a product, they're happy with that product, but they just need to do some market research and get the product out there. So it covers any, I suppose, kind of prototype development costs or research costs associated with that.
And finally, in relation to the grants, you have a training grant, and you will cover 100% of training costs up to €150,000.
Yeah, the training grant is there. I suppose the theory behind it is that it's to allow somebody to develop their business. So if they identify a particular training need, and they identify a course that's out there that helps them overcome that need, that's what the training grant is there for.
Just in relation to the capital grant, because I'm assuming that that's the most popular grant of all, how are people gaining access to the other 50% funding in order to draw down a grant from WLD?
Yeah, it's a real struggle, Karl, and we're well aware of a lot of businesses that we just haven't been able to fund because they couldn't secure the other 50%. I suppose the big change that we see is from the last programme, typically the other 50% was made up of own resources with a bank loan, maybe on a 25% basis, the other 50% being our grant. On a lot of occasions now we see people looking for the full 50% from the bank, and it's difficult enough, for somebody to do that. And we've had a number of very good projects that just haven't happened for that reason. They just simply can't access the finance. Again, we try and facilitate that. We've approved projects on the basis that they can secure the funding. So I suppose we put our cards on the table first, and we've said, look, we've approved the grant. It means the promoter can go to the bank or financial institution and say, look, I've secured 50% here. But even in that instance, we've had businesses come back who just haven't been able to get the funding. So it's certainly a problem. And unfortunately, it's a problem that certainly hasn't eased in any way in our experience in the last 12 months.
And for those listening this morning that may have a business idea or might be in business already and looking to expand, what's the next step for them with WLD?
The next step is to contact us, Karl. We'd encourage people to contact us regardless of what stage you're at with an idea, because there's a lot of things maybe that people tend to overlook, and maybe they're 90% there and they find out that they have to have planning permission when they come to us, or some other bits and pieces in place. But certainly, regardless of what stage people are at, we'd like to hear from them. It's generally very easy for us to determine whether or not the project is eligible, so we don't waste people's time. So, as I said at the outset, we're certainly open for business. We'd love to hear from people. If people want to contact us, we have a website, wld.ie. Our main number is 053 9155 800. And if they contact myself or Tom Birmingham or Seamus Dorn, my colleagues, you can get in touch with any of the three of us if they have a query.
Thank you very much for your time this morning, Brian, and it was a very insightful interview, and I'm sure that some of our listeners will be in touch in relation to seeking more information from you. Thank you very much, Brian. Coming up after the 11 o'clock news, I speak to Ed Hendrick, founder of multi-award-winning Sanru.com, about how he developed his business into an international success. Stay tuned.
You're listening to South East Radio's Business Matters, with thanks to Wexford Insurances. Wexford Insurances, #1 for business insurance in County Wexford.